Han Solo, former Imperial officer, sat despondently at a sticky table in a dingy bar on Devaron, sipping an inferior Alderaanian ale and wishing he were alone. Not that he minded the other denizens of the bar, horned Devish males and furry Devish females, plus a smattering of non-humans from other worlds. Han was used to aliens. He'd grown up with them aboard Trader's Luck, a large trading ship that wandered the space lanes of the galaxy. By the time he was 10, Han had been able to speak and understand half a dozen non-human languages. No, it wasn't the aliens around him. It was the alien beside him. Han took a swig of his ale, grimaced at the sour taste, then glanced sidelong at the cause of all of his troubles. The huge, hairy being gazed back at him with concerned blue eyes. Han sighed heavily. If only he'd go home. But the Wookiee, Chew something, utterly refused to go home to Kashyyyk, despite Han's repeated urging. The alien claimed he owed something called a life debt to former Imperial Lieutenant Han Solo. Han raised his glass in a slightly unsteady hand and gulped the sour ale. He put the empty tankard down and glanced around the bar for the server. Need another drink. One more and I'll feel much better. Just one more. The Wookiee moaned quietly. Han's scowl deepened. Keep your opinions to yourself, hairball, he snarled. I'll know when I've had enough. I need you like I need a blaster burn on my butt. Affronted, Chewbacca drew himself up to his full Wookiee height and growled low in his throat. Yeah, I know I tossed away my career and my living that day on Coruscant when I stopped Commander Nicholas from shooting you. I hate slavery, and watching Nicholas use a force whip ain't a particularly appetizing sight. I know Wookiees, you see. When I was growing up, a Wookiee was my best friend. I couldn't just stand there and watch him blast you. Don't go trying to make me out of some kind of hero, Chewie. I don't need a partner, and I don't want a friend. My name says it all, pal. Solo. Chewie stared at Han for a long moment, then he snorted disdainfully, turned, and strode out of the bar. Han wondered disinterestedly if he'd actually managed to convince the big hairy oaf to leave for good. If he had, that was reason for celebration, for another drink. As he glanced around the bar, Han saw that, over in the corner, several patrons were gathering around a table. A Sabacc game was forming. Han wondered whether he ought to try and get in on it. He usually had very good luck at Sabacc, and every credit counted these days. These days. In a moment of painful honesty, Han admitted that he probably wouldn't have been able to stay in the Imperial Navy even if he hadn't gotten himself cashiered for rescuing and freeing Chewbacca, an Imperial slave. He'd started his career with high hopes, but disillusionment had quickly set in. The prejudice against non-humans had been hard to take for someone raised the way Han had been, but he'd bitten his tongue and remained silent. But the endless, silly bureaucratic regs, the blind stupidity of so many of the officers, Han had already begun to wonder how long he'd be able to take it. But he'd never figured on a dishonorable discharge, loss of pension and back pay, and, worst of all, being blacklisted as a pilot. They hadn't taken his license, but Han had quickly discovered that no legitimate company would hire him. He'd tramped the permacrete of Coruscant for weeks, in between alcoholic binges, looking for work, and found all respectable doors closed to him. Then, one night, as he'd tavern hopped in a section of the planet-wide city near the alien ghetto, a huge, furred shadow had flowed out of the deeper shadows of an alley and confronted Han, thanking him for saving his life and freeing him from slavery. Chewie had been quite direct. His people didn't mince words. He, Chewbacca, had sworn a life debt to Han Solo. Where Han went, from that day forward, he would go too. And he had. When Han had finally gotten them passage off Coruscant, piloting a ship with a load of contraband to Tralis, Chewbacca had gone with him. On the week-long voyage, Han had begun teaching the Wookiee the rudiments of piloting. Han hoped that teaching him a skill would make it easier to get rid of him on some world. If he knew the Wookiee could hire on as a skilled pilot or co-pilot, Han wouldn't hesitate to dump him in some port and then lift ship. Or so Han told himself. The smuggler rose to his feet and strolled across the room to the table. Greetings, gentles, he said in basic. Got room for another player? The dealer, A Devaronian male turned his head with its waxed, polished horns to regard Han questioningly. He must have decided that the newcomer looked okay because he shrugged and gestured at the vacant seat.
As long as your credits hold out, pilot, so does your welcome.
He grinned, showing sharp, feral teeth. Han nodded, then slid into the seat. He'd first learned to play Sabacc when he was about 14. Han anteed credits into the high-stakes pot, the Sabacc pot, then picked up the 2 cards he'd been dealt and scanned them, all the while covertly studying his opponents. Han had the 6 of staves and the Queen of Air and Darkness, but at any moment the dealer could push a button and all the card values would change. Han eyed his opponents. A tiny Sulistan, a furry Devaronian female, the Devaronian male dealer, and a huge female Barabel, a reptiloid being from Barab 1. This was the first time Han had been up close to a Barabel, and she was an impressive sight. Over 2 meters tall, covered with tough black scales that would repel even a stun blast, the Barabel had a mouthful of dagger-like teeth and a club-like tail that reportedly made them nasty customers in a fight. This one, who had introduced herself as Shallamar, seemed peaceful enough, though. She picked up the newest card chip she'd been dealt and studied her hand intently through narrow, slit-pupiled eyes. The object of Sabacc was to get cards to equal but not exceed the number 23, either positive or negative. At the moment, the cards in Han's hand had a numerical value of positive 4. The Queen of Air and Darkness had a value of -2. Han could throw that card into the interference field, which would freeze its value, then hope to get the Idiot and a card with the face value of 3. Since the Idiot had a value of 0, this would give him an Idiot's Array, which would beat even a pure Sabacc. As Han hesitated, gazing at his queen, the card chips rippled and altered. Han grinned. He tossed the 3 of coins and the Idiot into the interference field, and his luck held. The very next change of cards left him holding the 2 of flasks. Idiot's Array, Han said casually, tossing the 2 down next to the other 2 cards in the interference field. Sabacc pot is mine, ladies and gentlemen. He bent forward to scoop up the pot, and the Barabel female let out a roar.
Cheater! No one can be so lucky.
Han sat back and stared at her, outraged. He'd cheated at Sabacc plenty of times, but this time he'd won fair and square. He smiled smugly as he reached for the last of the card chips. Seeing that smile, the Barabel roared again. Snarling, she advanced on Han.
I'm going to bite your head off, cheater! We'll see how good you are then!
Han took one look at her gaping maw, realizing that she was big enough to make good on her threat, and went for his blaster. His right hand dropped to his thigh with blurring speed. Then the well-worn grip was there, nestled against his palm, more familiar than the flesh of any lover. His hand, still moving with extraordinary speed, started back up as he began his draw, only to stop short when the blaster hung up in the holster. The Barabel leaped for him. Han jumped back, but not far enough. Shallamar's huge, sharp talons grabbed the front of his jacket, slashing the tough material as though it were tissue. Still yanking at his trapped blaster, Han was hauled toward the Barabel's wide-open mouth so fast his vision blurred. Suddenly, Han glimpsed a blur of brownish tan at the corner of his vision, just as a huge roar nearly deafened him. A long, furred arm snaked around Shallamar's neck, jerking her back away from Han. "Hold her for a second, Chewie!" Han yelled, yanking at the bottom of his holster as he twisted the grip of his blaster. He pulled it up and sighted at the Barabel as she wrestled with the Wookiee, but he couldn't get a clear shot. Chewbacca and Shallamar whirled in a blur of brown fur and black scales. Then Shallamar lowered her head and snapped at the Wookiee's arm. Her needle-sharp teeth sheared off a chunk of fur and meat. The Wookiee roared in agony and with a burst of strength, grabbed the Barabel's arm and slung her around with dizzying speed so fast that her feet slid out from under her. As she went down, Chewie also grabbed her tail, swinging her so hard she was airborne. Shallamar landed on her back amid a ruin of chairs, tables, and Sabacc card chips. "Chewie, come on!" Han yelled. Chewie, dripping blood, was right behind Han as they raced for the exit, knocking over chairs and tables.